The temple air was thick with the scent of burnt resin and cold stone. 9-year-old Hannibal Barca knelt, his knees pressing into the unforgiving floor. Above him, his father, Hamilcar, loomed like a shadow against the flickering altar light. Hamilcar gripped the boy's wrist, forcing his palm toward the heart of the sacrificial flame. The heat was immediate, biting, and sharp. It seared the air around his skin. "Swear," his father commanded, his voice a low vibration that cut through the silence of the chamber. "Swear that you will never be a friend to Rome." Hannibal felt the fire lick at his knuckles. He locked his gaze onto the pulsing orange light, the smell of singeing air filling his lungs. He did not pull back. He did not flinch. He spoke the words, a vow that tasted like iron and smoke. The promise hung in the stagnant air, binding his future to the ruin of the Republic across the sea. In that moment, the boy died, and the instrument of vengeance took his place. He pulled his hand back, skin flushed red, and looked up at his father. The path was set. Carthage had changed, but not in the way Hannibal had envisioned. The marble halls of the Senate were now dominated by the merchant class, men who measured the weight of their ships in gold rather than the reach of their empire. Hannibal walked through the central plaza, ignoring the clatter of coins. He stepped into the council chamber, the air stale with the smell of parchment and dry ink. The councilors sat in rows, debating trade routes while the shadow of Rome lengthened over the Mediterranean. "We need iron," Hannibal stated, his voice ringing against the vaulted ceiling. "We need levies. We need a strike force that can cross the sea." A senior merchant laughed, tapping a heavy ledger. "War is a ledger." "Hannibal, it is bad for trade." Hannibal leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the speaker's podium until the wood groaned. He did not care for their ledgers or their profit margins. He looked at the map spread out before them, his eyes tracing the path toward the north. While they counted their silver, he was counting the days until he could break the Roman grip. He turned his back on the council, leaving them to their coins, and stepped out into the harbor to find men who still knew how to fight. The coast of Spain hummed with the sound of thousands of boots against the sand. Hannibal stood on a ridge overlooking the sprawling camp. It was a volatile collection of men, Numidian horsemen checking their bridles, Gauls sharpening steel, and mercenaries from every corner of the Mediterranean sharpening their resolve. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust, sweat, and animal musk. Then came the tremor. The ground vibrated under the rhythmic, heavy steps of 37 elephants. They were massive, alien shapes against the horizon, their trunks swaying with a heavy, deliberate grace. The sight of them stopped the murmurs in the camp. Even the most hardened soldiers paused to watch the beasts move into formation. Hannibal signaled the column to advance. The march began not with a shout, but with the steady, grinding sound of wheels and thousands of marching feet. As the vanguard cleared the camp gates, the news began to spread inland, rippling across the sea to the Roman Senate. It was an audacious gamble that defied every established rule of Mediterranean warfare. Hannibal rode at the front, his eyes fixed on the distant, jagged line of the north. He had left the comfort of the coast behind, and with every mile gained, the world held its breath in disbelief. The rhythm of the march changed. The steady thud of boots on dry earth faded, replaced by the crunch of gravel and the biting snap of wind. Hannibal halted the vanguard at the base of the foothills. He looked up. The world had vanished, replaced by a jagged, vertical wall of white ice that scraped the clouds. It was a barrier that defied the logic of maps and the reach of empires. The soldiers behind him slowed, then stopped. Men who had fought across the plains of Spain stood silent, their heads tilted back, eyes tracing the sheer cliffs that rose into the freezing mist. There was no path. There was only the immense, suffocating scale of the peaks. A Numidian scout pointed toward a narrow, snow-dusted ridge, his hand trembling slightly. The elephants, sensing the change in air pressure, let out low, mournful bellows that echoed off the rock faces. Hannibal watched the frost begin to settle on the bridles of his horses. He knew this was the end of the known world. Behind him, the army was a long, winding snake of steel and muscle, but here, it looked like nothing more than a thin line of ants against a crushing, frozen titan. He gripped the reins, exhaled a plume of white vapor, and signaled the order to climb. The incline was immediate. The path, barely wide enough for a single pack mule, snaked upward through a landscape of frozen mud and shattered shale. Every step required a calculation of weight and balance. Hannibal moved on foot, his boots sliding against the slick, treacherous surface as he gripped the jagged stone face to pull himself higher. The air grew thin, burning the lungs with every intake. Below him, the column became a chaotic tangle of men and beasts. A sharp crack echoed through the pass as the earth beneath a supply wagon liquefied under the pressure. The ground slumped, dragging the heavy frame toward the edge. Soldiers dropped their packs and lunged, hands clawing at the mud to anchor the sliding timber. They dug their fingers into the freezing sludge, veins bulging in their forearms, muscles straining until the wagon groaned and settled back against the rock. It was a brutal, grinding labor that turned the soldiers into creatures of pure instinct. They were no longer marching to war. They were fighting the mountain for every inch of progress. Above, the sky narrowed into a sliver of gray, offering no path forward, only the relentless, biting cold that numbed their grip and stiffened their resolve.
The mountain was not a barrier to be crossed, but a predator waiting for the first sign of weakness.
The sky turned white. A gale-force wind roared through the pass, shredding the visibility until a man could not see his own outstretched hand. It was no longer a march. It was a blind scramble through a frozen void. A pack horse, blinded by the stinging ice, reared back and kicked wildly, its hooves striking only empty air. The animal panicked, thrashing against its harness, and tipped over the precipice. It did not make a sound as it fell, just a sudden, sickening absence of weight. The scream came from the handler who reached out, lost his footing on the slick ice, and followed the beast into the dark maw of the ravine below. There was no time to mourn. The wind howled, drowning out the shouts of the men behind. Another soldier slipped, his fingers scraping uselessly against the frozen rock before he disappeared into the white curtain. Every step became a gamble with death. Men grabbed hold of each other, forming human chains to keep from being swept away by the gusts. The mountain was not just cold, it was predatory, testing the limits of their sanity. Hannibal stared into the swirling gale, his face numb, watching the column fracture as the mountain claimed its tribute in blood and bone.
The elephants were the final victims of the pass. Their massive bodies, built for the heat of the plains,
shuddered uncontrollably in the biting altitude. The thin air labored their breathing, creating rhythmic, hollow rasps that echoed against the canyon walls. One by one, their thick feet lost purchase on the ice-crusted shelf.
The lead elephant slipped, its trunk lashing out to find a hold, but the rock crumbled under its weight.
It slid, legs splayed, sliding inches toward the void before the handlers wedged wooden poles under its belly to stop the descent.
The beast bellowed, a sound of pure, raw panic that tore through the mountain silence. It remained stuck there, trembling, while the men shoveled snow to clear a path, their hands raw and bleeding. Another animal collapsed, its legs locking in the freezing slush, unable to rise. The handlers had to leave it behind. It stood in the white expanse, head drooping, as the rest of the column pushed past.
Each step the remaining elephants took was a slow, agonizing heave against gravity and ice. Their exhaustion was total, a mirror of the human endurance being ground down to nothing. Hannibal watched from the rear, his eyes fixed on the heavy, rhythmic swaying of the survivors, knowing that every inch gained was paid for in blood. The slope finally leveled out. The air grew thick, damp, and sweet with the scent of pine and wet earth. One by one, the survivors stumbled out of the cloud line and onto the floor of the Po Valley.
They were a hollowed-out shell of the army that had left Spain. Where there had been thousands, only ragged lines of gaunt men remained.
They moved with a strange, synchronized silence. The terror of the peaks had burned away the weak. Those who stood now were iron. Hannibal rode down the line, his horse picking its way through the mud. He did not look for the missing. He looked at the eyes of the men left. They were sunken, hollowed by frost, but steady. He signaled a halt. The soldiers dropped their packs into the mud without a word. There was no cheering, no celebration of survival. Instead, they began to sharpen their blades. They checked the tension on their bows. They cleaned the grit from their sandals. The transformation was complete. The mountain had not broken them. It had tempered them into a weapon. Hannibal watched them prepare, seeing the change in their posture. They were no longer mercenaries or tribal levies. They were a singular, disciplined force, forged in ice and ready to descend upon the unsuspecting plains. The march was over. The war had begun. The news arrived in Rome like a fever. Merchants spoke of a ghost army appearing from the northern peaks, a force that had defied the impossible. In the Senate, the air grew heavy with debate. Most urged caution, but Consul Sempronius stood, his hand gripping the edge of the rostrum. He dismissed the reports as exaggerations from frightened scouts. He demanded the standards be raised, his voice echoing against the marble pillars. He refused to wait for the winter to pass or for the main forces to consolidate. He saw only a chance for glory, a quick strike to crush a ragged band of invaders before they could find their footing. He ordered the legions to march north with immediate haste. The soldiers gathered their gear, their movements hurried and sloppy, driven by the consul's impatience. They marched along the riverbanks, their boots kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still air. They did not notice the scouts watching from the ridges. They did not see the subtle shifts in the landscape that marked the presence of a predator. Sempronius pushed his men harder, riding at the front, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He believed he was the hunter, closing in on a broken enemy. He was already inside the killing zone, and he did not even know the door had been locked behind him. The Trebia River cut through the valley like a vein of liquid ice. Its banks were slick with frost, and the current ran deep and fast, churning against the jagged stones. Sempronius halted his legions at the edge, but the pause was brief. From the far bank, a small detachment of Numidian horsemen appeared. They did not stand their ground. They unleashed a volley of javelins, then wheeled their mounts and galloped back into the swirling morning mist. The Roman consul surged forward.
His irritation overriding his caution, he signaled the advance. The heavy infantry waded into the water.
It was not a shallow crossing. The river rose to their thighs, then their waists, dragging at their legs with a numbing, relentless pull. Their iron gear became a burden, dragging them deeper into the slush. Hannibal watched from the high ridge, his hands gripped tight on the reins of his horse. He saw the Roman formation lose its symmetry, the men stumbling as the current fought their progress. The trap was set. The water was deep enough to slow them to a crawl, but shallow enough to lure them into the center. The Roman line stretched thin, shivering and exposed, as they struggled to maintain their footing on the slick riverbed.
Every step forward was a step further from safety. They were committed now, mid-river,
with the current sapping the warmth from their bodies, unaware of the silent lines of infantry waiting in the brush ahead.
The signal came from a single horn blast that cut through the mist. Hannibal's hidden infantry broke from the brush, their spears leveled at the shivering, waterlogged Roman line. The impact was absolute. Romans, already struggling for balance in the waist-deep current, were driven backward into the deepening channel. There was no room to swing a sword, no space to raise a shield. They were caught in a press of iron and freezing water. The Numidian cavalry circled the flanks, raining javelins into the center of the trapped mass. Panic replaced order. Soldiers discarded their heavy gear, but the mud of the riverbed held them fast. Hannibal descended the ridge, his eyes scanning the carnage as the resistance crumbled. The consul's pride dissolved into a desperate scramble for the far bank. but the path was blocked by wall-to-wall spears. By the time the sun fully broke over the valley, the river was no longer just water. It was a choked corridor of defeat. The Roman confidence,
once so ironclad, lay shattered in the silt. Hannibal did not celebrate. He watched the final pockets of resistance fade, then turned his horse toward the next horizon, his gaze fixed on the road to Rome.
The morning at Lake Trasimene was heavy with a white, suffocating mist.
It clung to the surface of the water and spilled over the narrow track where the Roman legion marched. Visibility dropped to a few paces. The rhythmic thud of thousands of boots on the damp earth muffled all other sounds. The Roman scouts moved blindly ahead, their hands outstretched to find the path. They did not see the movement on the hills above. Hannibal had positioned his men along the slopes, hidden behind the thick curtain of vapor. He waited. He watched the Roman column snake through the narrow corridor between the rising ground and the lake.
His infantry stood motionless, spears gripped in sweating palms, eyes fixed on the gray void below.
The Romans were deep within the trap, their long lines stretched thin and vulnerable. They were unaware that the ground surrounding them had been occupied for hours. Hannibal raised his arm. The air remained silent, but the tension on the slopes reached a breaking point. With a single sharp motion,
he dropped his hand. The hidden forces erupted from the mist, a wall of iron descending upon the flank of the unsuspecting column. The trap snapped shut with the sound of thousands of shields colliding at once. The Roman line shattered under the weight of the assault. Soldiers pushed back by the relentless pressure found no footing. Only the cold, murky depths of the lake. They stumbled,
armor clattering against the rocky shore before sliding into the water. The surface, once calm and gray,
churned with the chaos of thousands thrashing against the inevitable. Spears reached down from the bank, pinning men against the shallows. Swords swung in the spray. The water darkened. A spreading crimson bloom that stained the reeds and the white stones of the beach. There was no escape. Those who tried to swim were struck down by javelins, their bodies sinking into the silt. By midday, the struggle had slowed to the rhythmic work of execution. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise of battle.
News of the slaughter reached the capital by evening. It did not arrive as a report,
but as a contagion of terror. Men stared at the walls of the city, their hands trembling as they realized the impossible had happened. The lake had swallowed a legion whole. The Republic stood paralyzed. The certainty of its own survival dissolving in the shadow of the man who had turned the water to blood. The news arrived in Rome like a physical blow. The Senate doors stayed locked through the night. The sound of shouting spilling into the empty streets. Senators paced the stone floors, their scrolls abandoned,
their voices cracking as they argued over the defense of the city. Guards hammered iron beams across the main gates,
the ringing of steel against wood echoing through the silent plazas. Every hour brought rumors of movement in the north.
Hannibal was not just winning battles, he was erasing the reach of the Republic.
He moved his army across the Italian countryside, burning grain stores and tearing down the symbols of Roman governance in every village he touched.
Local magistrates fled their villas, leaving behind records and coin as the presence of the Carthaginian army drew closer. Smoke rose from the horizon in a dozen directions at once,
a permanent reminder of the encroaching threat. The prestige that had held the provinces together for centuries was dissolving. Markets sat empty. The fields went unharvested. Rome was a city under siege from within,
waiting for a predator that refused to follow the rules of war. Every messenger that rode into the city brought the same word. The countryside was gone, and the shadow of the army was lengthening. The Senate reached its breaking point. They stopped debating and started counting. Every eligible citizen, every freedman, every ally was pressed into service. They gathered the largest force the Republic had ever fielded, a tide of iron and leather that stretched for miles as it marched south. The sheer volume of men was meant to be a final, crushing answer to the threat. Thousands of shields caught the midday sun, creating a blinding, metallic horizon that obscured the dust of the road. Commanders rode the length of the columns, their voices hoarse from shouting orders, their faces set with the certainty that numbers alone would break the stalemate. The ground vibrated under the rhythmic stomp of 80,000 boots. They reached the plains of Cannae and began to deploy, forming a dense, immovable mass that occupied the entire valley. The sheer density of the formation made it seem as if the earth itself had been paved with steel. Roman scouts looked out over the flat expanse, seeing only the vast, organized grid of their own strength. They felt untouchable. They believed the trap was not for them, but for the man waiting in the distance. The sun beat down on the polished breastplates, the air heavy with the scent of sweat and anticipation as the final assembly of Roman power stood ready to erase the shadow that had haunted their borders for years. Hannibal watched the Roman line from the rise of the hill. He did not mirror their rigid, rectangular mass. Instead, he signaled his officers. The center of his line, composed of his least experienced infantry, stepped forward, while the flanks of heavy veterans held back. The formation began to curve, bowing inward like a drawn bowstring. It looked like a mistake. To the Roman observers, it appeared as if the center was already buckling under the sheer weight of the impending clash. Hannibal adjusted the position of his cavalry on the wings, anchoring them to the riverbank and the open plain. He was gambling everything on the momentum of the enemy. He needed the Romans to charge into the center, to push hard against the weakest point of his line, and to ignore the trap closing on their sides. He paced the line, his boots crunching into the dry earth, checking the angle of the crescent one last time. The men in the center tightened their grips on their shields, bracing for an impact they knew they could not stop. They were bait. The entire strategy hung on the precision of that curve.
As the Roman horns sounded the advance, the ground began to tremble. Hannibal stood perfectly still,
his eyes fixed on the center of the Roman mass, waiting for the first wave to commit to the kill. The Roman advance started as a slow, rhythmic march, but as the distance closed, the pace quickened.
They saw the Carthaginian center retreating, the line bending back under their gaze. A roar went up from the Roman front ranks. They believed the center was failing. They pushed harder, shield against shield,
boots carving furrows into the dust. The Roman commanders, riding at the rear, signaled for the second and third lines to surge forward, feeding more men into the center to widen the perceived breach. Every step was a commitment. The Romans crowded into the space, shoulder to shoulder, their formation becoming a dense, suffocating wedge. They ignored the flanks. Their eyes were locked on the retreating Carthaginian infantry, who moved back with measured steps, refusing to break. The pressure on the center increased, the earth shaking with the weight of thousands of men converging on a single point. The Romans poured into the hollow space like water into a basin, convinced they were driving a wedge through the heart of the enemy.
They did not notice the heavy veterans on the wings remaining perfectly still. They did not notice the narrowing of the field.
They only saw the gap, and they ran into it, eager to claim the victory they thought was already theirs. The Roman surge hit its limit. They were deep within the Carthaginian pocket, their shields overlapping, their formation dense and immobile. Then the signal sounded. The retreating Carthaginian center stopped in its tracks.
They did not turn to flee. They turned to fight. The men who had been falling back dug their heels into the soil, locked their shields, and stood as an immovable barrier.
The momentum of the Roman mass hit this wall and shuddered. The forward motion stopped dead. In that split second of confusion, the flanks moved. The heavy veterans on the Carthaginian wings pivoted inward. They moved with rhythmic precision, closing the gap like a closing jaw. The Romans in the middle realized the shift. The men on the outer edges of the Roman formation turned their heads, seeing the lines of veterans closing in from the left and right. There was no more space to advance. There was no room to swing a sword. The Romans were pressed so tightly together that they could not raise their arms. The crescent had inverted, turning the trap into a steel ring. The Romans pushed against the center, but the center held. They pushed against the sides, but the sides were now a wall of iron. The trap had snapped shut. The Roman infantry was now a trapped mass, but the true nightmare arrived from behind. A low, rhythmic thunder began to vibrate through the ground, vibrating through the soles of the soldiers' boots. It was not the sound of marching feet. It was the frantic, heavy gallop of horses. Hannibal's cavalry, having shattered the Roman wings, swung wide and thundered around the rear of the entire formation. The Romans at the back turned, their faces draining of color as they saw the dust cloud rising. There was no room to maneuver, no space to form a defensive line. The cavalry slammed into the exposed rear guard with the force of a landslide. The impact sent a shockwave through the crowded center, crushing the men at the back against their own comrades in the front. The exit was gone. The encirclement was absolute. Hannibal had turned the battlefield into a sealed tomb. The soldiers in the middle of the mass, unable to see the sky or the horizon, felt the pressure tighten. Panic flickered, then roared into life. The Roman army was no longer a military force. It was a herd, hemmed in by iron and blood, waiting for the final, inevitable collapse as the cavalry tightened the knot. The slaughter was not a battle, it was a harvest. With nowhere to retreat, the Roman lines dissolved into a chaotic, suffocating press. Hannibal's men moved through the gaps with cold precision, systematically dismantling the trapped mass. The ground became slick with blood and unstable underfoot. Men fell, only to be trampled by those behind them, creating mounds that rose higher as the afternoon wore on. There was no space for the Romans to strike back. They stood shoulder to shoulder, paralyzed by the weight of their own ranks, as the blades found their marks. For hours, the rhythm of the strike was constant, relentless, and absolute. By the time the sun dipped low, the field was a silent expanse of ruin. 50,000 men lay still in the dust. The sheer scale of the destruction defied comprehension. Across the sea, the news traveled like a spreading fire. Rome went silent. The Senate chambers stood empty as the city locked its gates. The Republic waited, paralyzed by the realization that its strongest army had vanished in a single afternoon. The path to the capital lay open, and the breath of the city hitched in anticipation of the final, decisive blow. The horizon was clear. The road to the gates of Rome sat empty, waiting for the conqueror to move. Hannibal rode across the field, his boots crunching on the brittle, blood-soaked earth. He stopped at the edge of his camp, looking at the supply wagons. They were near empty. He checked the iron-bound battering rams brought from Spain. The wood was splintered, the heavy bronze heads cracked from the long march over the mountains. He had no siege engines to break the city walls, and his mercenaries were exhausted, their weapons notched from the day's work. His captains gathered, pointing toward the south, demanding the final advance. Hannibal shook his head. He looked at the horizon, then back at the broken wagons. Without a fresh supply line from the sea and without the heavy machinery to breach stone fortifications, a march on the capital was a march into a starved death. He ordered the camp to turn away from the city. The decision rippled through his ranks like a cold wind. His allies shouted, their voices rising in protest, but he did not waver. He chose to hold his position, tethered by a lack of gear and a thinning larder, leaving the gates of the Republic standing, for now, untouched. Rome responded not with steel, but with patience. The Senate appointed Fabius Maximus, a man who understood that time was the only weapon needed. He did not march to meet Hannibal. He did not form lines for a grand confrontation.
Instead, he kept his legions on the high ground, watching from the ridges like a shadow.
Whenever Hannibal moved, Fabius moved in parallel. Whenever Hannibal set up camp, the Romans stayed just out of reach. Hannibal sent his cavalry to provoke a fight, burning nearby farms and blocking supply routes, but the Roman camps remained shuttered and cold. The strategy was silent and absolute.
Hannibal's men grew restless. They were built for the shock of the charge, not for this slow, invisible erosion. Every day without a battle was a day the grain stores emptied.
Every week without a victory was a week the horses grew thinner and the camp fires dimmed. Hannibal watched the ridges from his tent, seeing the Roman banners flickering in the distance. He could not reach the enemy, and he could not force the issue.
The ground beneath his army began to feel like a cage. The land was being stripped of its life by the very people he sought to conquer,
leaving him to preside over a force that was slowly eating itself alive. The seasons bled into one another. Hannibal remained in Italy, a predator pacing the perimeter of a vast, silent enclosure. He marched his men through the valleys of the south, searching for a flaw in the Roman resolve.
But every village he reached was a shell. The wells were poisoned, the grain stores burned,
and the livestock driven into the mountains. He was undefeated on the field.
Yet he was losing the war 1 mile at a time. One afternoon he led a detachment toward a fortified granary in the Apennines. His men broke the doors with axes, expecting the bounty of a harvest, but found only ash and dust. The local farmers had fled days before, taking everything. Hannibal stood in the center of the empty storehouse,
the dry, charred debris crunching beneath his boots. He walked outside and stared at the horizon,
where the Roman scouts were always visible, perched on the highest peaks like vultures.
His grip on the region was slipping. The dream of a broken republic felt increasingly distant,
replaced by the daily struggle to keep his men fed and his horses standing. He was a lion in a cage of his own making,
unable to strike, unable to retreat, and watching his strength bleed out into the Italian soil.
The news arrived on a dry, windswept morning. A messenger rode into the Carthaginian camp, his horse lathered in sweat, carrying dispatches from the Senate. Scipio Africanus had crossed the Mediterranean. He was no longer a student of war. He was an architect of it. He had studied every maneuver Hannibal had used at the Trebia, at Trasimene, and at Cannae. Now, he was applying those lessons against the heart of Carthage itself. The threat was immediate. Scipio had secured local alliances, turning the tide against the Punic grip on Africa. Hannibal read the scrolls, his eyes scanning the reports of burning ports and lost territory. The strategy of attrition had failed. He could no longer afford to hold the Italian peninsula while his home was being dismantled. He walked to the edge of his command tent and looked out at the camp.
The men were waiting, their faces etched with the fatigue of years in the field.
He gave the order to break camp. There would be no final march on Rome. There would be no siege. He turned his back on the Italian ridges and prepared his army to depart. The war had shifted. The hunter was now the hunted, and the road back to Carthage was the only path left to save his people from the shadow of the Republic. The plains of Zama stretched flat and unforgiving beneath the midday sun. Hannibal rode to the front of his lines, his eyes scanning the horizon. There, across the dusty expanse, the Roman legions stood in a formation that felt disturbingly familiar. He saw the spacing of the maniples and the positioning of the cavalry. It was not merely a defense, it was a mirror. Scipio Africanus sat atop his horse, a calm stillness radiating from the Roman command. Hannibal moved forward to meet him in the space between the two massive armies. They stood within reach of one another, the silence of 10,000 men pressing in. Hannibal looked at the Roman general and saw the reflection of his own years of campaigning. Scipio did not blink. He watched the Carthaginian ranks with a precision that chilled the air. Hannibal realized in that moment that his own tactical language had been mastered. Every feint, every pivot, every calculated retreat he had perfected was now held against him. He turned his horse and rode back to his own center, the dust kicking up under his mount. He adjusted his grip on the reins. The time for maneuvering had ended. The two architects of war stood ready to dismantle each other on the altar of history.
Hannibal raised his arm. The signal surged through the lines. The elephants roared.
A wall of gray weight gathering speed across the dry plains. They trampled the dust, tusks lowered, charging directly into the Roman center. The ground shuddered under the impact of their advance, but the Roman lines did not shatter. Scipio had prepared. At his command, 1,000 horns blasted in unison, a piercing, metallic shriek that echoed across the field. The Roman soldiers did not stand their ground. They stepped aside, opening wide lanes through their ranks. The massive beasts hit nothing but air. Deprived of their target and deafened by the noise, the elephants stalled. Then, the Romans threw javelins, sharpened iron bit into thick skin. The beasts recoiled, trumpeting in agony. They spun in circles, trampling their own handlers, and broke back toward the Carthaginian front.
Hannibal watched as his own formation collapsed under the weight of his own weapon. His center buckled. The lines scrambled to evade the panicked animals, and the disciplined order he had built moments ago dissolved into a frantic, dust-choked mess. The trap had been turned inside out. Hannibal spurred his horse forward, shouting commands that were swallowed by the din of steel on steel.
He tried to pull his second line forward to plug the gap, but the momentum had shifted irrevocably.
His men were tripping over the bodies of their own comrades, eyes wide with the terror of a closing vice.
Then, the ground behind him began to rumble again, not with elephants, but with the rhythmic,
thunderous stampede of Roman cavalry. Scipio had timed the pincer movement with surgical precision. The Roman horsemen slammed into the rear of the Carthaginian infantry, a wall of iron and fury.
Hannibal looked left, then right. His banners were falling, one by one, into the churned,
blood-soaked earth. There was no maneuvering left to do. The center was crushed. He saw his officers dropping their pikes in surrender.
He realized the war for Carthage was over. A spear hissed past his head, biting into the air. He turned his horse away from the slaughter, his heels digging into the flanks of his mount.
He did not look back at the carnage. He rode until the shouts of his dying army faded into the wind.
The invincible general reduced to a fugitive in the dust of his own shattered dream.
The map of the Mediterranean became a labyrinth of dead ends. Hannibal moved through the eastern kingdoms like a shadow,
trading his golden reputation for temporary sanctuary.
He slept in guest chambers with his boots on and his sword within reach, ears tuned to the sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor.
Every stranger at the gate was a potential informant.
Every merchant bearing gifts was a potential assassin sent by the Senate. He spent his days in the courts of foreign kings,
offering military counsel that no one dared to fully trust, his presence a heavy burden of past glory.
He watched the horizon for Roman sails, knowing the Republic did not forgive and never forgot. He changed cities with the seasons, leaving behind nothing but whispers of his former strength. In the markets of Bithynia,
he walked with his head lowered, eyes darting to the reflective surfaces of bronze shields,
searching for the familiar insignia of his enemies. He was a lion whose cage had expanded to the size of a continent.
Yet he remained trapped behind bars of his own making.
The silence of the night was the only thing that moved with him, a constant reminder that the chase had never truly ended.
The villa in Bithynia was quiet, save for the dry rustle of parchment on the desk. Hannibal looked up from his maps. The usual birdsong in the garden had ceased. He stood, his joints stiff from years of travel,
and moved to the heavy wooden shutter. He pushed it back an inch. Below, in the courtyard,
the shadows shifted. Roman guards, their metal plates dull and grim, were sealing every exit. They moved with a deliberate, practiced silence. He counted them, 6 at the gate, 4 near the stables.
There was no path to the hills. There was no path to the sea. He turned back into the room,
his breath slow and even. The hunt had reached its final yard. He walked to the corner of the chamber where he kept his belongings. His hand hovered over his gear, fingers brushing the rough texture of his discarded travel items.
He reached inside the fold of his inner layer, feeling for the cold,
hard edge of the ring. He pulled it out, the metal biting into his palm. Outside, a heavy boot struck the front door. The wood groaned under the impact. He did not flinch. He simply stood in the center of the room. the ring held tight between his thumb and forefinger, waiting for the lock to give way. The heavy oak door splintered inward, sending shards of wood skittering across the stone floor. Hannibal did not look at the men who flooded the room. His focus remained entirely on the small, metallic circle in his hand. He tilted his head back, his throat moving once, hard. The bitter, metallic taste hit his tongue, a final, sharp sting that cut through the stale air of the chamber. He dropped the ring. It clattered against the tiles, a small, hollow sound that vanished into the shouting of the guards. His knees hit the floor first. The weight of decades, the frozen mountain passes, the crushing heat of the plains, the endless years of exile simply evaporated. He leaned forward, his hands sliding across the smooth surface of the stone. His vision blurred, narrowing to a single point of light, then nothing. Around him, the soldiers froze, their weapons raised, but the man they had hunted across the world was already beyond their reach. The room fell into an absolute, profound silence. The oath sworn in the temple so long ago was finally fulfilled, not in battle, but in the quiet stillness of a man who had at last set his own terms. Hannibal Barca lay still, the war finally over.